All right, everybody, I'm ready to get started. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back to the end of the seventh week together. We've covered a decent amount so far in the second part of the course. We're going to cover yet another chapter today, and then we'll only have one chapter to go. But it's a fairly long chapter, so it'll be stretched out over, I think, about a week and a half to 2 weeks. And of course, there's a spring break in there in the middle of that chapter. So the second exam won't occur till after the spring break. As I mentioned last time, spring break is an opportunity to get caught up, to get ahead, to knock out some of those mini papers. And as I mentioned, chapter 6 that we covered last time, the one dealing with procurement of inputs and solving the principal agent problem. That chapter will have a mini paper due at the end of spring break, so you can write on that up until the end of spring break. And then, of course, this one today as well, which deals with the nature of industry, sort of the main characteristics that set one industry aside from another, and kind of like different measures that we have to gauge those differences, and the things that we can attribute to be responsible for those differences. So there's like a lot of sort of broad, important, and very sort of applicable concepts that can be applied to your cases, which make, at the very least, chapter 7 pretty versatile as far as like using the info for mini papers. So jump on that opportunity. Don't let it pass you by. Knock out the paper. The sooner the better. I know some of you might have already been working on this stuff to the point where you're done already. Like you've done 3 mini papers. I know there are some people like that. Good for you if you've done that. If you haven't, get ahead. Get it done. Don't let this become a burden to you. Don't let this become a hindrance to getting a good grade in the class. Like ultimately it's an easy component of the course if you spend the right amount of time on the paper at the right times during the semester. So I know that the people that are like committed to doing well are already on top of this stuff, but I'm always trying to kind of talk to those people that are on the fence, like right on the cusp of like doing the right things for yourselves, and like just kind of need that extra nudge to get you over that fence. So hopefully I'm getting through to some of you, but it doesn't fail. Like in the end, like I always wind up getting like, I don't know, a third to a half of the people like turning in the mini papers on the last 3 options, and it's like, and then the papers aren't that great, and they turn in like half papers, and I don't give them credit for it. Like, it's just like, don't let that happen to you. It's silly because you understand that this class is a challenge overall. So by you kind of putting the simple things off and just letting them become a problem, like you're creating a new challenge for yourself, and you're kind of exacerbating the severity of the situation for yourself. So don't let that happen. Yes.
Since we're talking about the paper for the final paper, do you expect us to use the outside source like the articles back on the website?
Uh,
And if it's not necessary, do you still want us to have a couple for the final
Well, I mean, like I've specified what the requirements are for the assignment. So for this class, I have not specified that you need outside sources, so it's not necessary. But if you do have outside sources, you should cite them properly. That's it. Yeah, and you don't need to cite the case because the case is what the paper's based on, and I understand where it's coming from, so you don't need to cite that. Uh, yeah, this is not like a huge research paper. It's more about you just kind of being able to practically think through some issues that the theory that we cover in the class can kind of help kind of filter your thought process through, and ultimately, ideally, give you a broader understanding of what we're covering here and how it might apply to the real world. Yeah.
But since we're using concepts in the book, you still want us to have that, right?
No, no, no. I understand you're using concepts from the book. Like that's the assignment. So, yeah. Uh, any other questions you'd like me to address before I move on with today's chapter? All right. So chapter 7 has to do with the nature of industry. The first part covers market structure. So how is the market structure? Are there a lot of big firms? Are there a lot of small firms? We talked about how long run costs can dictate sort of the nature of how that might ultimately look, how the structure of the industry might look. If there's increasing returns to scale, meaning there's decreasing average total cost in the long run, then it benefits firms to get bigger because their average cost of production becomes less as they get bigger. And so the only way a firm can compete in that kind of industry is to be big. And so that kind of industry would be suited to an oligopoly, which is an industry that has a few large firms kind of dominating it, having the majority of the market share, which we'll also talk about. So we'll talk about a couple of measures to kind of measure how we gauge the size of different firms within an industry, how we measure how concentrated the industry is as far as market share, and how also like the government plays a role in kind of trying to monitor that using these measures. So a lot of different issues will be touched upon in this first part. Then we'll talk about conduct. Conduct has to do with, well, how do firms actually conduct themselves within these various industries? Well, given different characteristics, they're going to have more ability to charge prices above their costs. And so we'll look at that. And then also like the patterns of mergers, and some industries are more easily suited for there to be larger firms and smaller firms, so that those kind of industries will tend to have more mergers than others. And then we'll talk about the different kinds of mergers that can happen: vertical, horizontal, and conglomerate. And then we'll talk about performance, like how well are these firms doing? How well can firms do in industries that vary in these attributes with respect to like their profits, which is ultimately again how we value firms, the present discounted value of their profits, and also like what kind of impact like the nature of the industry, the structure of the industry has on the efficiency of the market. And efficiency in economics, when we're talking about that, we're talking about consumer and producer surplus. So is that at its maximum? Is that being eroded quite a bit, meaning there's a lot of deadweight loss? Well, we've got a measure to kind of gauge that. And then finally, just a couple of last words will be said about sort of the causal link between these three like main sort of components of an industry. Like there's an ongoing kind of discussion about like whether market structure causes behavior or whether behavior causes market structure. So I'll just lightly touch upon some issues there. And then we actually won't finish chapter 7 today. I'll finish it on Tuesday. And that last part just kind of introduces us to the 4 main market settings that we'll be studying moving forward, which are perfect competition at one end of the spectrum, being the most competitive possible industry, monopoly being the other end of the spectrum, being the least competitive, and then in the middle you have oligopolies and you have monopolistic competition. Monopolistic competition is a setting in which you have a lot of competition amongst firms, but firms are able to sort of create enough kind of brand identity where the good that they're selling is different enough from their competitors that they kind of create sort of a sub-market for it, and therefore they tend to have some ability to charge above their own costs, which is called market power, which is ultimately what leads to firms making greater profits, their abilities to do that. And so those are the 4 settings we'll be studying moving forward. And so we'll just kind of talk about like each one individually on Tuesday, right before we jump into chapter 8, which will start us analyzing actually perfect competition, and then we'll jump on, I think, monopoly on Thursday, and then monopolistic competition when we get back, and then second exam. All right, other questions? Any questions that might have arisen while I gave my little intro there? All right, let's go then. So market structure. Market structure refers to factors such as the number of firms that compete in a market, the relative size of the firm, the market concentration. Are there a lot of big firms and just some small ones, or is everybody kind of small, everybody kind of in the middle? Technological and cost conditions, which ultimately tell us a lot about the potential for that concentration, again, having to do with like either the industry having, increasing, decreasing, or constant returns to scale. Um, Demand conditions. So, how elastic is demand with respect to the elasticity for a firm with respect to like the elasticity of the entire industry. We talked about how elasticity tends to be less for general products versus like individual firm products. So like food tends to be less elastic than like the demand for like bread or something. So the following subsections provide, oh yeah, and the ease with which firms can enter or exit an industry, that's huge. Also, with respect to informing how competitive the industry can be, the market structure. If there are barriers to entry that stop other firms from getting into the industry to compete, then that's going to lead to a lot more ability for firms to have market power, for them to dominate the industry. Therefore, you'll likely have larger firms that dominate. So we'll talk about a couple of those things. So the following subsections provide an overview of the major structural variables that affect managerial decisions with respect to market structure. All right, so the first thing we can talk about is firm size. So there are big differences in the size of each industry's largest firm. So advertising marketing, you've got this Omnicom Group, $13 billion, nearly $14 billion. This data comes from Fortune 500 lists from 2012. You'll have like Nike. So for the apparel industry, you've got Nike, sales being roughly 21 billion. Entertainment, Walt Disney being roughly 41 billion, and that likely has gone bigger as a result of the purchase of like Pixar and Marvel and Star Wars that basically happened over the last 5 years. That's like dramatically increased their revenues. So definitely like the largest firm in any particular industry will vary quite a bit as far as like their overall revenues from industry to industry. You have Walmart with a huge amount of revenues. They're like nearly $500 billion just in 2012. But the relative position of a large firm can change over time. Changes in the competitor strategies or changes in market conditions can change a firm's relative position within an industry, or potentially change the viability of the industry itself. We saw that, very clearly over the last like 30 years with the big digital revolution that kind of changed our dependence on like analog to digital with respect to like a lot of things that can be produced digitally. So Kodak was a huge company as far as like producing physical film for just like taking stills, and also providing film stock for the film industry. And now they're close to going out of business. They still exist. They're still a brand, right? People have that awareness of that brand, so it carries value. They just haven't quite figured out how to like reemerge as like a leader in the new version of the industries that they operate in. But again, like the point here is that like the largest firm of any particular industry will vary with respect to the industry, and that will change with respect to conditions in the market. The remainder of the chapter and the course will take a deeper look at how these variations can occur. All right, so another important variable is industry concentration. So another factor that affects managerial decisions is the size distribution of firms within an industry. The optimal decisions of a manager who faces little competition from other firms in the industry will differ from those of a manager who works in an industry in which there are many firms. And that is why we have to consider each market setting differently in order to figure out like what are the optimal decisions that a manager can make in each different type of industry, in the four that I mentioned that we'll be covering moving forward. But again, in order to do that, in order to compare like the costs and benefits of doing business, in order to establish like optimal pricing, optimal output, which leads to then profits that are maximized, you need a framework for that. So you need a framework of costs. And that's what chapter 5 was about. But in order to get a framework of costs, you need to talk about what those costs are from. And that's why we talked about production in the short run and the long run. So you need all of that in order to then have that foundation to be able to then make assertions about like how best to approach each of these varying market settings. And so it's all very relevant. It's all very connected. And I hope that you have made an effort to at least, have a strong understanding of like the relationship between the assumed production characteristics that we talked about and how they relate to the costs that will be relevant as we move forward to, again, thinking about how managers can operate in these varying industry settings that will vary with respect to how concentrated they are. So we're going to examine 2 measures that economists use to gauge the degree of concentration in an industry. So concentration ratios measure how much of the total output in an industry is produced by the largest firms in that industry. The most common concentration ratio is known as the C4 concentration ratio. It's the 4-firm concentration ratio. It's the fraction of total industry sales produced by the largest 4 firms in the industry. So if we let S1, S2, S3, and S4 denote the sales of the 4 largest firms in an industry, and we let ST denote the total sales of the firms in the industry, then the 4-firm concentration ratio is the ratio of the sum of the sales of the 4 firms to the overall sales in the industry. Another way to think about it, the 4-firm concentration ratio is the sum of the market shares of the top 4 firms in the industry. So each individual firm's portion of overall sales, which is essentially this same expression, but just separating each term. So if we let C4 be equal to the sum of the market shares of the 4 largest firms, where the market shares are equal to an individual firm's sales as a fraction of the overall firm sales, then the sum of those 4 is equivalent to that expression there, which again is also the 4-firm concentration ratio, the proportion of sales of the 4 largest firms of an industry. So when an industry is composed of a very large number of firms, each of which is very small, the 4-firm concentration ratio is going to be close to 0. It's going to be small because the 4 largest firms will comprise sales that are a small portion of the overall sales in the industry. There's a lot of other firms selling stuff, and everybody's getting a small piece of that pie. When 4 or fewer firms produce all of an industry's output, then the 4-firm concentration ratio will be equal to 1. The 4 largest firms, if there are 4, will comprise the entirety of the sales, and therefore, again, you're going to have this number essentially be equal to this number, so you'll have a 4-firm concentration ratio equal to 1. Obviously, the more concentrated the industry is going to be, the more sales are going to be in the hands of fewer firms, which means that there's going to be more ability of those firms to dominate the industry. Whereas if you have a low 4-firm concentration ratio, there aren't a lot of firms that have any kind of dominance in the industry. There's a lot of competition. So a lower 4-firm concentration ratio will imply more competition. Yeah. No, you would not, because like they're not really trying to generate revenue, so they're not selling anything. So they don't have any sales that can go into like total sales for the industry yet. We would just consider like private entities in private markets. So the closer the 4-firm concentration ratio is to 0, the less concentrated is the industry. The closer the ratio is to 1, the more concentrated is the industry. The more concentrated the industry, the less competitive. Quick demonstration problem. Suppose an industry is composed of 6 firms. 4 firms have sales of $10 each, and 2 firms have sales of $5 each. What is the 4-firm concentration ratio for this industry? So we need to get the sum of all the firm sales to get the total sales for the industry, and then, of course, take the sum of the top 4 as a fraction of that. So in this case, total industry sales is equal to 50. You've got 4 firms that sell $10 each, so that's 40. 2 firms sell 5, so that's 10. So that's a total of 50. So that's the total sales of the industry. The sale of the largest 4 firms obviously is going to equal 40, right? The other 2 firms are smaller. We're looking at the top 4 largest firms. So therefore, the sales of the large firms is equal to 40. 4 times 10. So the 4 firm concentration ratio is equal to the ratio of 40 to 50, which is equal to 0.8. So we have a 0.8 4 firm concentration ratio, which means that the 4 largest firms comprise 80% of the sales of the industry. That means the industry is very concentrated, and the firms have a lot of what we call market power. Market power means they have the ability to charge above their marginal cost, their extra cost of producing additional units, also known as the derivative of the total cost function. Another measure of concentration is known as the Herfindahl-Hirschman index. The Herfindahl-Hirschman index, or HHI, is the sum of the squared market shares of firms in a given industry, multiplied by 10,000 to eliminate the need for decimals. By squaring the market shares before adding them, the index weights firms with higher market shares more heavily. So suppose firm I's share, so just some firm I, just a general firm I, their share of total market output is, again, their sales is a fraction of total industry sales. So that's what the WI is. It's their market share. Where SI is firm SI sales, and ST is the total sales in the industry. Then the Herfindahl-Hirschman index will be equal to 10,000 times the sum of the squared market shares of each of these firms. So again, this is sigma notation. It's just telling us that we are summing these terms for all I firms. So however many there are, I can equal 2, I can equal 20, I can equal 50. The value of the Herfindahl-Hirschman index will lie somewhere between 0 and 10,000. A value of 10,000 arises when you have a single firm with a market share of 1 existing in the industry. So that's when you have a monopoly, right? You have a monopoly, you're only going to have 1 firm. Its market share is going to be equal to its share of the sales will be equal to the total sales in the industry. So this will be equal to 1. So this will just be equal to 10,000 times 1. So therefore, the higher the Herfindahl-Hirschman index gets, the less competition it implies, the more concentration it implies, the more dominance there are by a few firms or even just 1 firm, if indeed the market allows for that kind of situation to exist. A value of 0 results when there are numerous infinitesimally small firms. So you're talking about like really small market shares. So you square a bunch of really small market shares, you get a really small number. Multiply that by 10,000, you're going to get a small number. So the smaller, again, the Herfindahl-Hirschman index is, the more competitive the industry will be, the less market power there'll be, the less dominance by large firms. Quick demonstration problem to just see how the mechanics of the measure work. Suppose an industry consists of 3 firms. 2 firms have sales of $10 each, and 1 firm has sales of $30 each. What is the Herfindahl-Hirschman index for this industry? What is the 4 firm concentration ratio? All right, so total industry sales in this case are going to equal, we got 2 firms that sell 10, 1 firm that sells 30, so that's going to be equal to 50. The largest firm has a market share of 30 over 50, and the other 2 firms each have a market share of 10 over 50. So the Herfindahl-Hirschman index for the industry will therefore be equal to 10,000 times the square of 30 over 50, the largest firm's market share, plus the square of the second largest firm's market share, and then the third also, that's equivalent to the second. So remember, you do parentheses first, then square those, then do this parentheses, and then multiply by 10,000. And that gets us, in this case, to a Herfindahl-Hirschman index of 4,400. I'll talk about a little bit later. The Justice Department and the Department The Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission are tasked with sort of monitoring how concentrated industries are. Whenever firms want to merge and become bigger, these two departments will generally make an analysis of the situation based on this measure, based on the C4, based on other kind of statistics to kind of gauge whether or not the competitiveness of the industry will be eroded, and if that's going to harm consumers or not, and therefore they'll make a determination of whether or not firms can merge or not. Recently, they stopped a big merger by two big healthcare companies. I forget who they were, but again, this is the kind of process that takes a long time, and generally, even when they make their determination that a merger should not move forward, the firms generally that are interested in merging will sue the government and try to fight. And so you need as much information as possible to form the argument that if you're going to stop firms from becoming bigger, that there's a reason for that. So these kinds of measures have a lot of weight in that kind of analysis and those determinations. I'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about conduct. The 4-firm concentration ratio is going to be equal to 1 here because, again, you've got 3 firms that basically encompass the entire totality of sales in the industry, and therefore the 4 largest firms will, they'll fall into that that category, and therefore the sum of their market shares will be equal to 1, and so that's why you'll get that 1 C4 concentration ratio. So here we have some C4 and HHIs for varying industries in the U.S. There's considerable variation among industries in the degree of concentration. We can see that very clearly. Breweries, 90 C4, so very concentrated there. Furniture and related products, 11, not too concentrated. The Herfindahl-Hirschman indexes reported reveal a similar pattern. The industries with high 4-firm concentration ratios tend to have higher Herfindahl-Hirschman indexes. We don't have it for the breweries, but let's look at distilleries. They have a relatively high C470. HHI is 1519, which actually turns out to be relatively high as well, as far as the sort of the patterns that are observed, throughout industries throughout time. What else do we have here? Let me see. We have got furniture and related products. Again, they've got that low C4 and that low HHI as well. So you see a lot of competition there. Again, this means that there's a lot of firms selling furniture and related products in these industries, and each one has a very small market share. There are exceptions, though, to this pattern, where you see a high C4 leading to a higher HHI. So the motor vehicle industry and the snack food industry. So here's the snack food industry. We've got a C4 of 53 and an HHI of 1984. But a motor vehicle industry has a higher C4 and a lower HHI. So that tells us that the 4 largest firms tend to have a higher portion of sales in the motor vehicle industry, but there tends to be more firms in that industry, is what the HHI is telling us, than in the snack food industry, where the 4 largest firms don't have a lot of the sales as compared to the motor vehicle industry, but there seem to be a lot less firms competing in that industry based on what the HHI is telling us. Yeah.
So the C4 is telling us that how concentrated the market share of the top 4 firms, and HHI is telling us how many firms there are, how many sellers are distributed.
It's kind of like how the market shares are kind of like diffused across like the industry, and we can see that it's not as concentrated in the motor vehicle versus the snack food, because there's probably a lot more firms operating there, but yet you still have the largest firms having a bigger share of overall sales than you see in the snack food industry, where there seems to be less firms competing, which is what causes the higher HHI. So the information is coming from the concentration ratios come from 2007. And the U.S. Bureau of the Census provides this information, as well as for the HHI. But the Census Bureau approximates the HHI by using only data from the top 50 firms in the industry, so it's not exactly a perfect measure. Limitations of these measures. Statistics and other data should always be interpreted with caution. We saw that just in chapter 3 when we talked about regression analysis and how we have all these diagnostic statistics that kind of give us an idea about like the viability of the analysis, whether we can take the results of like statistical analysis to be statistically significant, meaning that they do predict actual relationships beyond the data. The data itself is the results from the data are not biased to the data. And so it's always really important to be very cautious when you're hearing statistics and you're hearing assertions made based on those statistics. It's important to understand that information is not perfect, and there are ways to sort of tell how legitimate and viable those conclusions are just based on the analysis made. And so don't ever take things at face value. And that's why it's important to understand statistics, how it works, how these methods work, their shortcomings, just in the most practical sense, not in the sense of like, oh, you might need to apply it to your work in the future. No, like just being just a normal citizen of this world, like you are susceptible to all sorts of manipulation based on assertions that are based completely on statistical analysis that is imperfect. So it's good for you to understand that how these things work and be able to sort of have kind of like that critical mindset when you're hearing information. And maybe even do some work on your own if it's something that's affecting you personally. Maybe do some work on your own to kind of like look at the actual studies that are being made, because they will have all those diagnostic statistics available, and then you can kind of decide, if this is something legitimate that you should be actually listening to and letting it affect your life. As far as what we're talking about here, the HHI indexes reported are only approximations. Since I already mentioned, the Census Bureau uses data on only the top 50 firms in the industry rather than data on all firms in the industry. There are 3 additional limitations to the numbers. One is that generally the numbers that we use here are based on the domestic industries that we're considering, and they don't consider sales internationally. So the 4 firm concentration ratios and the HHI, the Herfindahl-Hirschman indexes, reported earlier are based on a definition of product markets that exclude foreign imports. So this tends to overstate the true level of concentration in industries in which a significant number of foreign producers serve the market. So that's certainly a large limitation, given that markets are a lot more global now than they were 30 years ago, due to the fall of the Soviet Union and sort of the world becoming a lot more streamlined in terms of like one dominant economic paradigm, which is like it's kind of free market, but ultimately like kind of like a mixed economy approach where it's mainly free market, but the government does play a role in that. In the markets as well, in order to make sure that we avoid a lot of the abuses that could occur without the market, what we call market failures. But anyway, yeah, not defining the industries globally does tend to overstate how much market power the large firms have. So obviously that's a huge sort of argument that's made when the firms are trying to combat like decisions made by the Justice Department or the Federal Trade Commission, like basically, bringing in information about like the global market that they're actually operating in, and try to sort of, demonstrate that like firms getting bigger will lead to more concentration domestically, but internationally will lead to a more competitive sort of U.S. industry, relative to the rest of the world industry. Another limitation is national, regional, and local markets. If you think about, if you're looking at and you are generally with these measures looking at the entirety of the domestic market, the entire U.S., that can kind of cloud our idea of how concentrated markets might be regionally. So you might have like low C4s and low HHIs for the entire U.S., but if you look at maybe California, you might have like a different situation there where you'll have, maybe a lot more concentration for particular firms in those areas. So a second deficiency in the numbers is that they are based on figures for the entire U.S. When the relevant markets are local, the use of national data tends to understate the actual level of concentration in local markets. And just like one very stark and clear example is like the cable industry. Like, you can look at the market for cable services um, for the entire U.S. and it seems as though like the market would not be very concentrated. But then if you look regionally, if you look at just like California, if you look at just Los Angeles, it's very clear that the companies have kind of like broken up the areas, so like they wind up kind of sharing the states in a way that doesn't lead them to compete against each other, more just kind of them dominating one area versus another, and ultimately having a high degree of concentration in those areas that they've been designated to sell in. So yeah, the numbers can cloud like those details, which are important and can ultimately have a huge impact on whether or not we're deciding whether or not these larger industries should exist in the way that they do. So geographical differences among markets can lead to biases in concentration measures. And finally, how we define the industries and the product classes can have a huge impact. So, if we're talking about like a soft drink industry, that is going to give like Coca-Cola and Pepsi like a relatively small market share. If we're talking about all types of drinks that people buy versus like if we're talking about just colas, we're talking about just colas, and those firms are the dominant firms. They basically have the market. The C4 would likely be equal to 1 if we just looked at it that way. So how we define the product class or the industries can have a huge impact. And so that's another way that firms will generally fight like determinations by the government. They'll try to argue that their products are actually part of broader product classes, which would then lower the severity of their concentration. So the definition of product classes used to define industry can also affect the indexes. The 4-firm concentration ratio for soft drinks is 52%, which may seem surprisingly low when one considers Coca-Cola and Pepsi dominate the market for cola. So the product classes the Bureau of the Census uses to define the industry may include more types of like bottled and canned drinks, including birch beer, root beer, fruit drinks, ginger ale, iced tea, and lemonade. Products that really people that drink cola may not even think about as like a substitute for their cola. And so that's ultimately what's used is like cross price elasticities to gauge like how closely related consumers view products, and that is used to sort of support assertions of like a product being more narrowly defined versus more broadly defined. So as a general rule, products that are close substitutes, meaning they have large positive cross-price elasticities, the percent change in quantity demanded relative to the of one good relative to the percent change in price of a related good, the cross-price elasticities that we covered in chapter 3, are considered to belong to a given industry class. So again, this measure is not just something that you just should throw away in your mind. These things are important. They have a lot of importance, and they can make or break a case for a merger, which is huge, enormous, because obviously, like when you're talking about mergers, you're talking about a lot of money on the line. You're talking about potentially a lot of increased profits for industries. So they will take every piece of information they can get, and these kind of cases can be very contentious, and they can last a very long time and be very expensive, of course, as far as like litigation fees and whatnot. Another important factor that variable that affects market structure is technology. The technology being used that is going to say a lot about the costs that a firm either enjoys or is burdened by, depending on how one looks at it. So market structure is also informed by the technologies used to produce goods and services. Some industries are very labor intensive, requiring much more labor to produce goods and services. So as far as like the long run model that we were talking about in chapter 5, that helped us to get to that condition of optimal input mix selection that will minimize the cost of producing a targeted level of output, where we looked at the isoquant and the isocost and the point of tangency between them, the point where the slopes are equivalent is the cost minimizing input mix for a particular output amount. If that point of tangency occurs, so we're looking at the XY plane and we're looking at capital on the y-axis as we normally do, and labor on the x-axis, then a very labor-intensive process will have that point of tangency occur, closer to a lot more labor and a lot less capital. So like kind of towards the bottom right of the isoquant curve. So that will be a more labor-intensive process. Other industries are very capital intensive, requiring large investments in plant, equipment, and machines to be able to produce goods and services. So labor intensive techniques. One industry that's a good example is just like the iPhone industry. It's a very labor intensive process to put iPhones together. You need all the components, of course. Those are generally considered intermediate goods, and then all those components are put together by people. In generally that enormous plant in China, it's called Foxconn. You probably heard of it. It's like a whole world essentially in and of itself. It's kind of unfortunate though, because like it creates really difficult conditions for the workers. They have huge nets outside of the building meant to capture people, capture people, not capture them like they're prisoner, but like just capture them from killing themselves when they try to jump off the building, because apparently they've had those kind of problems, and that's why you'll see huge nets outside of those buildings. Those factories are working round the clock. Those people actually live at the factory. It's a very cold environment. There's very little social interaction. It's very strange. But there's less sort of protections for workers in China, so you're going to get a lot more abilities of firms to operate in those ways. Anyway, it's a labor-intensive process. They've managed to minimize their costs to the best way possible. Obviously, this is their approach, and this is what allows us to buy these things at least a reasonable price, in quotes. And it is what it is. But like other industries that are capital intensive, obviously will use more capital relative to labor. The differences in technology give rise to differences in production techniques across industries. In the petroleum refining industry, firms utilize approximately 1 employee for each 5 million in sales. So a lot of what is done in the oil industry is done by machinery, but obviously they do need some people, and they do use some people. But like that point of tangency, that optimal input mix that minimizes the cost of producing the output that they are looking to produce is going to happen, at some point high in the isoquant, isocost framework, and you're going to have a very kind of steep isocost line, which is going to lead to a point of tangency, which is going to reflect a lot of capital and a little bit of labor being used, at least for the oil industry. Technology is also important within a given industry. In some industries, firms have access to identical technologies and therefore have similar cost structures. So how easy it is to get the means to produce is a huge sort of determinant of how competitive an industry will be. In other industries, 1 or 2 firms may have access to a technology that's not available to other firms. Maybe they have a collective patent on it. Maybe they have gotten the exclusive right to use the production technology from the patent holder. Maybe they've invented it themselves. So in those industries, that becomes what's called a barrier to entry, right? Other firms cannot come in and compete because they cannot produce the same thing. Oftentimes in those kind of industries, you're going to see over the long run, some reverse engineering happening, or maybe just innovation that's going to be similar, which will ultimately allow other firms to create similar products in similar ways, or maybe the same product in similar ways. But that's in the long term. In the short term, for firms that have exclusive rights to particular production technologies, that's going to give them an advantage in the market, which will create a lot more concentration, a lot less competition. So firms with superior technology will have an advantage over other firms. When this technological advantage is significant, the technologically superior firm or firms will completely dominate the industry. All right, another important variable that informs market structure are the demand and market conditions. Industries also differ with regard to the underlying demand and market conditions. In industries with relatively low demand, the market may be able to be sustained only by a few firms. So you're going to get a large C4 there, a high HHI. So, this would be a case where like the Justice Department will look at it and say, well, there's not a lot of demand there, so really, yeah, even if these firms get bigger, like it's really kind of the nature of the industry to have like this kind of concentration, and so that would be okay, versus another industry where you might have a lot of demand, and therefore it becomes clear that firms are not merging to sort of help the market operate better, but they're just doing it to, raise profits and ultimately raise prices. In industries where demand is great, the market may require many firms to produce the quantity demanded. So that's the other side of that coin. The information accessible to consumers also tends to vary across markets. It's very easy for a consumer to find the lowest airfare on a flight from Washington to Los Angeles. So it's very easy for consumers to be able to compare the different airline flights that are available, and therefore that will allow for a more competitive industry. In contrast, it's much more difficult for consumers to obtain information about the best deal on a used car. The consumer not only has to bargain with potential sellers over the price, but also has to attempt to ascertain the quality of the car being purchased, right? Like, it's unclear in used car markets what you're actually buying. You need to get it checked out. Like, the price is not going to tell you much. So you can do all sorts of, comparisons online about prices, but in the end, like, what are you actually buying? Well, that's a question that then kind of doesn't allow for a lot of competition, because in the end, like, consumers have a lot of opportunity costs they have to incur in order to find their optimal purchasing choice. And so the less information, the less competitive the industry will be. The less information available to consumers. So as we'll learn in subsequent chapters, the optimal decisions of managers will vary depending on the amount of information available in the market. Information plays a huge role in oligopolies, where you have a few large firms dominating the market. The main characteristic of that market is interdependence. The firms, their decisions are not based on their own cost structures, not just based on the revenues they can gain, but it's also based on what their competitors are doing. And so they have to sort of try to optimize their behavior based on what they think their competitors are going to do, which complicates the situation, which is why we have two chapters that deal with oligopoly, and that's going to be the first half of the last part of the course. Lastly, the elasticity of demand for products tends to vary from industry to industry. In Chapter 3, we learned that the demand for a specific product depends on the number of close substitutes available for the product, right? If you've got 1,000 toothbrushes to choose from, that's going to be, you're going to be very sensitive to changes in price for toothbrushes, because you can easily just buy some competitor versus, like a really unique type of drink maybe that was just created that nobody else has a substitute for, that has very unique properties. Like that kind of product will have very elastic demand, a very inelastic demand, because there aren't a lot of close substitutes. So people would be willing to pay more for that type of product, given that they couldn't access it from any other producer. So in general, the demand for a particular brand of product will be more elastic than the demand for a product group. So food, like we said, would be less elastic than particular types of food. So we have this thing called the Rothschild Index that provides a measure of the sensitivity to price of the product group as a whole relative to the sensitivity of the quantity demanded of a single firm to a change in its own price. So how elastic is the overall industry to the elasticity of an individual firm within that industry? So it is the ratio of ET, which is the elasticity of demand for the total product, so the total market, and EF, which is the elasticity of demand for the product of an individual firm. the Rothschild index. The Rothschild index takes a value between 0 and 1. When the index is 1, the individual firm faces a demand curve that has the same sensitivity to price as the market demand curve. So that's going to mean that there aren't a lot of close substitutes. In this case, there are no close substitutes. It's a very unique product. Probably the firm has a patent on it. Maybe it's some life-saving drug that nobody else is able to produce. And so their elasticity of demand is the same as the industry's elasticity of demand, and therefore you're going to get 2 of the same number, which is going to equal a Rothschild index of 1. So the higher the Rothschild index is, that's going to imply less competition in the industry. It's going to imply more concentration in the industry. And obviously, as far as demand conditions go, a lot less sensitive consumers, because again, they don't have many substitutes. When the elasticity of demand for an individual firm's product is much greater, so again, there's a lot of close substitutes for the individual firm's product. And again, this is an absolute value because we're talking about a negative number in the own price elasticity. Then the elasticity of the market demand, the Rothschild index, is going to be close to 0 because, again, the individual firm's elasticity is going to be much bigger than the market elasticity. So therefore, you're going to have a big number dividing a smaller number, which will get us a smaller Rothschild index. So again, a smaller Rothschild index implies more competition, a lot more sensitivity to price changes by consumers, implying a lot more substitutes. A lot of information is in the Rothschild index. When an industry is composed of many firms, each producing similar products, the Rothschild index will be close to 0. So here we have some Rothschild indexes for different industries. The food industry, we've got the own price elasticity of market demand to be equal to 1, which is unit elastic, but we see the own price elasticity of demand for representative firms' products is negative 3.8, so 3.8. Fairly high, very elastic demand, and we see the Rothschild index 0.26. Makes sense. A lot of competition exists in the food industry. Tobacco industry, kind of a different story being told there. We've got the overall elasticity for cigarettes to be at negative 1.3, and that being the case as well for the individual firms. So there is competition in the tobacco industry, but it's limited. There's a lot of large firms. What this is telling us is that consumers are not sensitive at all to changes in price for their individual type of cigarettes that they smoke, and that makes a lot of sense given what we all might know about smokers. I was once a smoker. As a smoker, you're very loyal to your brand. So your brand of cigarettes is essentially cigarettes. That is all you want. That is all you buy. And generally, you will buy regardless of what the price is. And so it makes sense that, again, the Rothschild index would be equal to 1. But the case is also true that this is implying that there is not much competition in that industry, because there isn't. There really is only just a few large firms dominating that industry. And then we see similar patterns that imply the same things moving down. Textiles, that's just fabric, a lot more elastic for the individual firms than the overall demand for textiles, which implies a low Rothschild index. Paper, apparently in the paper industry, you're going to have elasticity very close to the elasticity of paper overall of individual firms, so you're going to get a high Rothschild index, etc. Quick demonstration problem to just kind of see how the mechanics of the index work. The industry elasticity of demand for airline travel is equal to -3. The elasticity of demand for an individual carrier is equal to -4. What is the Rothschild index for this industry? So very simple, right? Again, it's the ratio of the overall industry elasticity to the individual firm's elasticity. In this case, -3 over -4, which is equal to 0.75. So that actually does kind of mirror the industry that we are talking about here. Airline travel tends to not be dominated by a few large firms, which again will imply that there aren't going to be many close substitutes available for the options that people buy. And finally, the last important variable to consider that informs market structure is the potential for entry. How easy is it for firms to enter and exit an industry? So the final market structure variable we discussed in the chapter is the potential for industry for the potential for entry into an industry. Numerous factors can create a barrier to entry, making it difficult for other firms to enter the industry. One is capital requirements, so the requirements that they need to set up shop. Like, can they get their hands on the capital? Do they have the resource, the financial capital necessary to acquire the productive capital? So, if they don't, they can't get into the industry, they can't compete. Patents, again, patents will create that barrier to entry that will stop a firm either from being able to produce the product because they can't access the means to produce it, or they're not able to produce it because the patent protects the product itself, and therefore they cannot produce the same product. Economies of scale, decreasing average total cost in the long run. So we looked at that long U-shaped average total cost curve in the long run. Economies of scale reflect the fact that in a particular industry, the relevant range of production, so like the amount of demand that occurs in that industry, will occur over the range where long-run average total costs are decreasing. And so the economies of scale create a need for firms to be large in order for them to enjoy the cost benefits of being large, which then implies that you can only be large to compete in that industry, which creates a barrier to entry to smaller suppliers. So you see, like, as far as like maybe agriculture over the last century or so, large scale operations have sort of become the dominant model for agriculture, creating that barrier to entry of economies of scale, forcing a lot of like independent farmers out of business, also kind of forcing the hand of the government to impose those price floors, right? That are set above the price via subsidies in order to allow for some farmers to stay in business and be able to compete against like these firms that have to exist in the size they do, given the competitive nature of the industries they operate in. All right, let's look at conduct. How do firms behave as far as pricing and merger activity? So in addition to structural differences across industries, the conduct or behavior of firms also tends to differ across industries. Some industries charge higher markups than other industries. Some industries are more susceptible to mergers or takeovers than others. So let's talk about pricing behavior. Economists use what's called the Lerner Index to illustrate the disparity in markups. So how much firms are marking up their prices above their marginal cost of production. The Lerner Index is given by this ratio here, the difference between the price and the marginal cost of production as a fraction of the price. So how much is the price above the marginal cost? The Lerner Index is related to the markup charged by a firm, so we can manipulate this relationship here to derive the markup of the firm, which is the factor of proportionality that we multiply marginal cost with to get the price. So we just multiply. I don't need you to derive this, but I'm just going to show you how to derive it. So I'm going to get price on the left-hand side, so I'm going to multiply the whole thing by price. Then I'm going to add price to both sides here. I'm going to subtract price from both sides there to get that on the left-hand side. Then I'm going to factor out price from this term here. So that's going to equal price times L minus 1. Divide both sides by L minus 1. And that gets me to price equal to this expression here. And I'm going to factor out negative 1 there. So I'm going to switch these two, and the negative 1 up here will cancel out. And then another way to write this is 1 over 1 minus the Lerner Index times marginal cost equals price. So the 1 over 1 minus the Lerner Index is the markup factor. It's, again, the factor that marginal cost is multiplied by to get to the price. It defines the factor by which marginal cost is multiplied to obtain the price of the good. When the Lerner Index is equal to 0, so it's equal to 0 because the difference between price and marginal cost is 0. That means that price is marginal cost. They cannot charge above their marginal cost. That happens in a perfectly competitive industry. So when that happens, then you're going to get 1 minus 0, 1 over 1 equals 1, so price will equal marginal cost. and therefore the markup is not existent. Essentially, it's just equal to 1. If the learner index is equal to 1/2, then you got 1 minus 1/2 there, which is 1/2. 1 divided by 1/2 is equal to 2. That means that price is twice as high as marginal cost in the industry with a learner index of 2. So here we have some information on some various industries in the U.S. Data from this is I guess 1987, but the information is still viable in terms of like what it means. So huge markup factor there for the food industry. I'm sorry, huge markup factor there for the tobacco industry. Not surprising. Not very sensitive. The consumers aren't very sensitive to changes in price, so of course they're going to be able to. Firms are going to be able to charge higher prices. Obviously, also you're going to have high concentration in those industries. Higher concentration, bigger market shares, dominance by larger firms means a lot more market power, ability to charge above marginal cost. So huge markup factor leads to a learner index of 0.76. Or 0.76 is a learner index, and that leads to a huge markup factor. Anything else stand out here? No, not really. But like the pattern is there, and the relation between the learner index and the markup factor is there. Just understand what that is, the relation between those two. Demonstration problem. A firm in the airline industry has a marginal cost of 200, charges a price of 300. What is the learner index and what is the markup factor in this industry? So the learner index is, again, the difference between the price and the marginal cost as a fraction of the price. So we've got price of 300 minus marginal cost of 200. So we've got 100 over 300, the price. So the learner index is equal to 1/3. So we can look at the markup factor. It's equal to 1 over 1 minus the learner index. So 1 over 1 minus 1/3, which is 1 over 2/3, which is equal to 3/2, which is equal to 1.5, which means that in the airline industry, based on this information, that firms charge 50% above their marginal cost in their pricing. All right, let's look at integration and merger activity. Integration refers to uniting productive resources. Integration can occur through a merger. It can also occur at the formation of a firm. Mergers can result from an attempt by firms to reduce transaction costs, reap the benefits of economies of scale or scope, and increase their market power. So the Justice Department and the Federal Trade Commission will again do an analysis when firms want to merge, and if it's about lowering costs, then that would benefit the firm, because if they lower their costs, they're going to charge less. So that'll it would always benefit the firm. That would benefit like the markets as well, not just like the supply side of the market. But if they're just looking to increase their market power, then that's when it becomes a problem. Some mergers are friendly and some are hostile. We know that there are instances where mergers or takeovers occur because it's perceived that the management of one of the firms is doing an inadequate job of managing. And so you'll have sort of an aggressive takeover. You might have what are called activist investors that just, like, are interested in like taking control of certain firms, maybe guiding them in certain directions that are different from their current trajectories. Economists distinguish among 3 types of integration or mergers: vertical, horizontal, and conglomerate. Vertical integration is what we talked about in the last chapter. It refers to a situation where various stages in the production of a single product are carried out in a single firm. So if you have a car manufacturer who's producing that final good and service, the car, and they need that engine that they've been getting from a supplier, but there's a lot of transaction costs involved in that, specialized investments leading to relationship-specific exchanges, which can get expensive, or maybe the contracting environment is too expensive, then they decide to vertically integrate. So they will create a department within the firm to produce the engines themselves. Another type of integration is horizontal integration. Similar firms merging together to become a larger firm within that industry. So it refers to the merging of the production of similar products into a single firm. In contrast to vertical integration, which occurs because the strategy reduces transaction costs, The primary reasons firms engage in horizontal integration are: one, to enjoy the cost savings of economies of scale or scope, right? Economies of scale, they get bigger, decreasing average total cost in the long run, more profits. Economies of scope, producing things together is cheaper than producing them separately. We looked at the multi-product cost function at the beginning of last chapter, kind of shows the mechanics of that. To enhance their market power, of course, to get bigger so that they can have that huge, larger markup above their marginal costs. When the benefits of cost reductions are small relative to the gain in market power enjoyed by the horizontally integrated firm, the government may challenge the merger. The Federal Trade Commission and the Antitrust Division of the U.S. Department of Justice are empowered to file a lawsuit to prevent firms from merging into a single firm. Under their current horizontal merger guidelines, these antitrust authorities view industries with HHIs, Herfindahl-Hirschman indexes, in excess of 2,500 to be highly concentrated, and may attempt to block a horizontal merger even if it will increase the HHI by just 200 units. The book tells you more about their guidelines. It's important to stress that these are merely guidelines, and that's part of what creates the complexity there, because it does allow for gray areas, and therefore it allows for a lot of kind of loopholes that will allow for aggressive litigation to maybe push through a merger that one of these entities maybe was against. And the third type of merger is a conglomerate merger. A conglomerate merger involves the integration of different product lines into a single firm. The economic rationale for conglomerates is far from clear, because you are talking about different firms coming together, and you're going to lose specialization. So merging completely different business lines is often counterproductive, because doing so leads to a loss of specialization without offsetting beneficial synergies. Some have argued that conglomerate mergers can create synergies through improved cash flows for products with cyclical demands. So if you think about like Disney, who bought ABC Broadcasting, Disney was in the markets for attraction rides and films, filmed entertainment, and ABC was like a television broadcaster, but they bought them. It kind of makes sense if you think about like the cyclical demand sort of aspect to the Disney parks, where demand drops during the winter colder seasons versus the hotter seasons, so revenues drop. So maybe they were looking to get consistent revenues from some other markets, such as like the television advertising markets. Others have argued that when the supply of superior managerial talent is tight, the overall profits of a conglomerate managed by a superior CEO can exceed the combined profits of several independent but highly focused firms managed by different CEOs with only average managerial talent. So managerial talent itself may be the reason why conglomerate mergers may occur. Research, development, and advertising. One way firms gain a technological advantage is by engaging in research development and then obtaining a patent for the technology developed by the R&D. So again, that's another way that firms conduct themselves, by spending money on these things. You're going to see like pharmaceutical companies expending a lot of money on R&D. And then you're going to see a company like Kellogg not really expending quite at all, because of course, like, cereal is cereal ultimately, and there are 1,000 different Kellogg cereals at this point. We don't really need any more. So they wind up not spending too much. R&D spends quite. Bristol Myers Squibb, a pharmaceutical company, spends quite a bit. The degree to which they create brand awareness and identity through advertising can establish a market advantage if necessary. So you're going to see a company like Kellogg that has so many different products competing with other companies that also have so many different products, investing quite a bit of money into advertising. So in this case, 9.2% of their sales goes to advertising versus 4.9% for the pharmaceutical company, because again, they need to create that brand awareness, they need to create that brand loyalty that will allow them to have those consumers that will be willing to pay those higher prices. Finally, performance. Performance refers to the profits and social welfare that result in a given industry. It's important for future managers to recognize that profits and social welfare vary considerably across industries. Profits. So here we have some profits from different industries. You've got 15.9 profits as a percent of sales, 15.9 for pharmaceuticals, whereas for like cereal, it's at 10. Makes sense because pharmaceutical companies are going to tend to have patents. They're going to tend to have more barriers to entry. So you're going to wind up with an oligopoly here versus monopolistic competition here, which will yield higher profits. Ford sales were among the highest in the group, yet its profits as a percentage of sales were the second lowest in the group. So again, profits will range quite a bit depending on industry characteristics. As a manager, it would be a mistake to believe that just because your firm is large, it'll automatically earn profits. So you have to, again, understand the relation between revenues and costs and just be able to maximize those relationships. And then finally, social welfare. How well are these firms or industries performing with respect to how efficient the market is? Perfectly competitive markets where firms don't have market power will have consumer and producer surplus at their maximum. As market power increases, that erodes that because mutually beneficial transactions that could occur do not occur because firms with market power can charge above the marginal cost, which limits the amount of output in that industry, and therefore that amount of loss of transactions carries with it a loss in surplus, producer and consumer, which we call deadweight loss. So another gauge of industry performance is the amount of consumer and producer surplus generated in a market. We've got this thing called the Dansby-Willig Performance Index. It measures how much social welfare would improve if firms in an industry expanded output in a socially efficient manner. How much social welfare would improve is measured by consumer and producer surplus, or total surplus as you know it to be. If the Dansby-Willig index for an industry is 0, there are no gains to be obtained by inducing firms in the industry to alter their outputs. Consumer and producer surplus are maximized given industry demand and cost conditions. So you're going to have very competitive industries when you have Dansby-Willig indexes being very low, if not 0. When the index is greater than 0, social welfare would improve if industry output were expanded. So those will be situations where you're going to have market power, you're going to have a lot more concentration, you're going to have a lot larger firms dominating the market, if not even just one firm dominating the market. So here's some Dansby-Willig performance indexes. So we got the food industry. So all these are definitely positive. All of these industries would benefit by having a little bit more competition, shockingly. The one with the least competition tends to be here chemicals, which they tend to have patents for their stuff, so that kind of makes sense. Paper apparently is a very concentrated industry with a lot of market power. We probably don't notice it because even if they even the prices they charge are not that much, so it doesn't really bother us too much. But still, you could increase a lot of the efficiency of those markets in paper by maybe allowing for there to be smaller firms and kind of diffusing out that market concentration. So this last part I don't necessarily need to cover just because it is about kind of like the relationship between structure and conduct. If you're interested in kind of figuring out some of the issues related to like causality, like what came first, the chicken or the egg, is essentially the argument being considered here. Like what informs what? Does market structure inform conduct and performance, or does performance and conduct inform market structure? So that's an open question. It's an interesting one to consider, and I do welcome you to consider it. Beyond that, I hope you guys have a good weekend, and we'll see you guys on Tuesday. I've already opened up Chapter 6's homework. I'll open up Chapter 7 too if you want, but that one, I won't make that one due till after the break as well. So that's that. But make sure you knock out Chapter 5 and 6 this weekend. All right, I'll see you guys on Tuesday. Have a good weekend.